Greetings to all of Austria. Yeah, maybe let's start with the first topic. What is open source and why is it important to us? So, welcome. Hello. He is an open source activist, he's entrepreneur, he is developer, and overall just sympathetic, a very nice guy. And he will be talking about open source and why it's important. Many of you might know him. And many of you might even use open source software like LibreOffice or Firefox. But why is it important? Why is it important to be able to have the source code and to be able to edit the source code? Because usually I don't do that. So yeah, this will be the topic for the next 45 minutes. Have fun. Yeah, hello. And yeah, the question, why is open source important to me? First of all, it's about a keyword that comes up a lot lately, and that's digital sovereignty. And that's just acting on your own accord. So you can control what happens on your computer, or I can control what happens on my computer and what's happening there and what programs are running and all of that. So the software does what it's supposed to do, and the software does what I think it will do. Digital sovereignty. In the discussions, there are basically two areas for that. One area is hardware, so networks, components of the networks, but also the endpoints. And that's a big topic in politics. So maybe they don't want network components coming from China nor from the USA. But it's also about components for computers and smartphones. So there is a lot of importance on the software that it's free and you can run on the OS everything that you want to run. And then the other big area is software, which is very important, of course, for open source software. And this is what this is going to be about now, open software. So now the first question to you, who of you uses at least one open source product and is aware of it? So basically, if you say no, then actually we have to ask, don't you have an Android phone, Apple laptop, Firefox or Chrome? Because those are the most well-known and applications that most people use and that are actually basically open source. First of all, Android is open source. The Apple laptops, they use below the surface, they use a lot of very small open source applications, and Firefox and Chrome, of course, are open source frameworks that basically you can compile yourself if you want to. So then you can actually look at the source code and check it out and make an audit yourself, and you can check what is it doing. And then you could publish your own versions. So I like to start explaining what is a program and anyway. Maybe not everyone knows that. So what is the work a programmer is actually doing? A programmer opens an editor window. I just did this as an example with a C program. And this can be a text editor, just a writing program with a lot less features that you know from Word. There is no font size and nothing. You just write a text and that's it. And in these three lines, there is the command to write hello world to the computer screen. And the rest is just, yeah, some stuff happens in the background. But the main thing happening here is this print of hello world that will appear on the computer screen. And for humans, this is easily readable, comparably readable. And then we have to translate this. And to do that, we use a so-called compiler. This is, for example, the program GCC here. And GCC uses this hello.c file that we saw before in the text editor. And GCC turns this hello.c file into a file called hello, and that can now be run on the screen. And this is a relatively simple example. And if we now open the hello file, this is what that would look like if you view it in a text editor. And this is now basically unreadable for humans. This is machine code. And it's very difficult for humans to even understand this, if even possible, because a lot of this information is just not, a lot of information is just not in there. If I go back a bit, there is, for example, this line starting with ////, and this is a comment. So the programmer just put some additional information into the code. And a human reader can now read this, and it can help the human reader to understand the program, and can also comment with intent, but the computer doesn't need that. So at compiling, this will just be cut off. So in the compiled program, there is only the functionality. And that leads to the compiled binary being a lot less readable. So basically, we now have a black box. So the computer can read it, but humans cannot. And humans also cannot work with this because they cannot read it in the first place. So such programs, they can also get extremely complex and long. There can be loops. You can see that here in the middle of the screen. Maybe you can read it. There's a statement with while. So as long as a certain condition is met, this will happen. Then there are if statements. So you can go through the code, and it gets quite complex. And even these complex programs, they want to be understood, or they need to be readable for humans. And of course, you can only read what you have access to. So open source means software where the source code is accessible, and it has to be in a form that is readable and understandable by humans. Then, of course, it goes on. Another point is that the software is, you might copy and distribute the software as often as you like, and you can change it and edit it and give it to other people in the changed version. And just a comment, I am using open source and free software as synonyms. So many people do that. Yeah. So Basically, the source code has to be there, and I have to be allowed to modify it and give it to other people. So open source, also called free software, is a freedom, as in freedom of speech, and not in the sense of free beer. So it doesn't mean that you can just take it and consume it, but as in free speech. So you have freedoms. And also that you can change it and edit it. And if you don't like a function, then you can just build your own function on top of it or instead of it. And with free speech or free language, that also affects everyone. And it's a basic human right for a reason. So freedom of speech on the one side, but also the option to change software and edit software, and also the option to have other people edit software for you. It's not necessary that you do it yourself. But the option that you can say, this one software, this one feature in the software, I don't like that, and I would like another feature right here. And then you look for someone who can do that for you, and then they do that. And with closed source, that's very difficult. And basically, you only have the original manufacturer, and you can't just choose who works for you. So who makes open source? Open source is created by programmers who love programmers who like to give tasks to computers and interact with computers. And often software development, especially for bigger programs, happens in teams. So many people working on the same project, they will create a software. And in such teamworks, code is often recycled, reused, and changed and shared. And there will be sub-projects. And these sub-projects will include some sub-functionality that will be reused in other projects. So these programs, they exchange a lot between each other. And otherwise, more complex programs were basically not doable.
Okay, so the question then is, how can you make a living by developing open source software? Because the software, the program itself, it is open and free. But there's a couple of ways you can make a living from developing open source software. So a couple of my acquaintances are actually living off donations. There is a number of organizations that pay for open source development and to continue developing projects, and who honor the time that is being put into continuing to develop the software. There is software that is financed through the sale of hardware. Then there is the model of an enterprise edition where the basic version is free, but the enterprise edition has additional features and costs money. And there's also the opportunity to have dual licensing, So it's possible to have a database that so the MySQL database you can license as a closed source product if you wanted to include that into your own product as a software company, but at the same time, the same source code was available under an open source license. And finally, you can earn money by creating and running a platform based on open source software. For example, if you install a Nextcloud instance somewhere and you run it, of course, you can charge people for running this for them. So that's definitely possible. And then, unfortunately, there's another case, and you can use open source software to collect data about people and sell that data, and Google is doing that a lot, and Microsoft is kind of doing that using more and more open source software, and with the idea, from what I can see, these companies are moving into the direction of running a platform, collecting data about users, and then selling that data. That has the advantage that we get a lot more resources for open source software development, but nonetheless, we have to kind of liberate those projects from those companies. Open source software is no guarantee that my personal data is being protected, but software that does protect my privacy and provides digital sovereignty, that has to be open source software. At least that's my personal opinion. I think if you look at what is being collected from an Android phone, which is mostly open source software, which my Linux desktop doesn't do because I'm using other programs, other open source projects. I can audit an open source software. I can find a project that configures the open source software in a way that protects my privacy, but there's no guarantee just because it's open source that it does protect my privacy. But I can audit it, and I can modify it to disable these kinds of features. For example, with messengers, you can clearly see I've put together a list of the most used messengers, and there are two open source solutions in here, Signal and Element. And the Telegram is claiming that they're open source, but in the same sentence, they say, well, it's only the application, the client. So the server applications that Telegram is using, they are closed source. So infrastructure-wise, I cannot move away from the Telegram infrastructure. So that means I cannot disable a feature on the server side, because the server infrastructure cannot be modified or cannot even be reproduced. So you cannot run your own Telegram server. And so this chat solution is not really not that great. But it is claimed as the client is open source. So, for example, I could port it to an operating system that they are not supporting right now. The situation is a bit better with Signal. It is open source, but the basic implementation of Signal is actually transmitting your phone number to a third party. So Signal is not always the best solution. So there are open source alternatives, which is very nice. So I started with open source because there are alternatives, and people there really care about privacy and similar data protection issues. So today, I would always recommend Element and Matrix and Riot, which is all open source. It's federated, so everybody can run their own server. And the servers talk to each other. So a user on one platform can talk to a user on a different platform. It's encrypted. It works very well. And that, so you always have to read the fine print to see what it really is. Is that a great solution for my privacy and my digital sovereignty? Okay, let's get to the next topic, the licenses. Basically, the programmer of a software is deciding who can use it and under which conditions it can be distributed. And overall, there are over 200 open source licenses, and that's a lot. So you usually look at this in two groups. The one is the group of GPL and similar licenses, which stipulate that all changes need to be published under the same conditions as the original code. And then there is the kind of BSD licenses, where only the original code needs to be republished under the same license, but changes not necessarily. The GPL, the General Public License, has been created in '83 by Richard Stallman, and he started developing open software in a university capacity, and he noticed that companies would take the open source code and simply take it and make it into proprietary software, and students would work during their time at university on this code and then take that code with them to their employer after finishing uni. And the idea behind the GPL is to disallow, to stop people from making the resulting code unfree, non-free. If you take the software and modify it, then you have to publish the changes. The changed software has to be published, including its source code, under the same GPL license. And that is the main difference to the BSD licenses, which don't have this clause. So there's a couple of successes and failures of the GPL. So TomTom was one of the first example of the changes they made, changes to the Linux kernel, and forgot to publish their changes. And people downloaded the binary image and said, well, this looks familiar, and started analyzing this image and found out it's running a Linux kernel. But it's running Linux, but they probably needed to make some adjustments to be able to run it, but they didn't publish those changes. So the actual navigation system itself, that continues to be proprietary, and they didn't need to publish it. Android is free software, as available for many different phones, hardware platforms, and Minix is an operating system. So in the 90s, you could use the source code, but only for educational purposes. And that was one of the reasons Linus Torvalds decided to create his own kernel to develop Linux. The disadvantages, this restrictions from the GPL that the changes need to be published again. You get incompatibilities, and that sometimes means that you need to re-implement something. So ZFS and Btrfs are two file systems, and they're used to, like, that is a software that stores files on disks, and those are two drivers, so to speak. And Btrfs is a GPL software, and ZFS is a more open license, but ZFS cannot be integrated into the Linux kernel as a standard part of Linux because it is incompatible with the GPL. On the other hand, we have the BSD-like licenses. They do not require changes to be published again, but they have one big advantage for users. They're much easier to read and use for the users. So a typical BSD license has a maximum of 10 lines. And there's much fewer side effects of the license than with the GPL. So the story of the BSD license pretty much hinges on the history of the BSD Linux. There's other open source operating systems apart from Linux. And the Berkeley software distribution, BSD, is one of the oldest operating systems that was created as part of the source code of AT&T Unix, because a couple students went over there, and AT&T started to charge licensing fees. And so at Berkeley, people decided to remove the proprietary code and simply publish the open source code themselves. That took quite a long time, and it culminated in a court case between BSDI, who was marketing BSD, and AT&T sued them, claiming that 18,000 files of the BSD distribution were including custom code from AT&T. And that was one of the reasons Linus actually wrote the Linux kernel, because it was completely unclear what would happen to BSD because of this claim that 18,000 files were stolen from AT&T. So eventually the court decided that of those many files, only 4 files or 3 files were really encumbered by AT&T. And what really happened was that AT&T took the code from Berkeley and simply removed the copyright notice from Berkeley and claimed those were their own files. So Berkeley was able to win this court case, and so that means there are less dependencies. But you can also see the disadvantage. Minix as an open source operating system so Minix decided to change to a BSD-like license, and they removed the clause that only allowed this code for educational purposes. And so Intel decided, oh, cool, small operating system. Let's take this code and use that as the base for our management engine. Because it's a BSD license, we can take the code and we don't have to publish our changes. So the interesting factoid is that there is a small Minix installation inside every Intel CPU that is used for diagnostics and managing the computer. So technically, that makes Minix one of the most used operating systems in the world. So it would have been maybe it would have been better to use a GPL license. So what else is out there in terms of open source software? The encryption software PGP was limited by US export laws. So you couldn't get it in Europe. The US said if the software is developed over here, and if it's being exported, it cannot use more stronger keys or stronger algorithms. It cannot be used, and only so much that they could still break the encryption. So the solution was to redevelop it under the GPL license and redevelop it in Europe. And this started the GNU PG project. Werner Koch was instrumental in that. Thank you. And that allowed us to have more digital sovereignty.
So StarOffice and LibreOffice are other examples. That's the next project or product that I want to talk about. It was created in the 90s as well by a Hamburg firm, and it was an Office packet that had the main feature that it would run on Linux. In 96 to 99, you could buy StarOffice for Linux. Yeah, that was until 1999. And Microsoft, of course, always was a strong opponent. And then 2000. Then later, in 99, it was bought by Sun. And for the first time, it was not. It became open source. And the main advantage of this was that it would become available for many, many platforms. And Sun also found that bug reports would be a lot easier by this. And they found a lot of errors and could sort them out easier. Then 2008, it went a bit backwards when Oracle bought them and changed the license again. So then OpenOffice could be forked. And that's also another advantage of open source. So because open source is there to stay. So once the software is open source, and even if the manufacturer produces a new version that's not open source anymore, then you just take the old version and keep working on that. So you basically create a fork. So you keep working on it under a new name. And so you have a good chance that such products will not disappear, and they will stay open source and will not disappear in just some cupboard. MySQL has MySQL has a similar destiny as LibreOffice. Oracle bought the project or bought the software, and then the project was forked. And then the project still is getting worked on independently. So there now is the MariaDB. Even such things as LineageOS and a lot of software that had a lot of work done by the manufacturers. So many people put in a lot of effort to really improve their open source software. For example, CyanogenMod, they created an alternative Android version. So they create images for smartphones with higher security standards than the Google Android versions. And so there was the CyanogenMod operating system for many years. And after many years, they said, well, we can't do that anymore. We can't keep doing a platform for that. And so it got a rebrand. It's now called LineageOS. And if you want that firmware on your Android phone, so a firmware that does not call home to Google immediately, then you can install that. And it will not siphon off as many data to the operating system manufacturer. Then you can have a look at this software. It's a very nice and well-functioning project for mobile phones. And of course, there's Firefox. So in the beginning, there was the Internet Explorer and of course Netscape, end of the 1990s. And then there was a big fight between the two. And then this big company called Microsoft went ahead and decided to use their dominant operating system to just bring out and create their own browser. And here the company Netscape, they suddenly seemed very small, even though they had a better browser back then. And in the end, Netscape was just forced to make their browser open source, or they decided to make it open source at the end of the 1990s. And that's how we got the Mozilla Foundation. And that's how the Firefox came to be. And open source is a very important topic in the browser discussions, because right now there's basically just two well-working browser stacks. There's the one by Mozilla and there's the one made by Google. And the others just didn't get any work done on them. And the websites are not really compatible anymore. And that's also a big problem we have in the open source world. But yeah, on the other side, Firefox, that works well. And yeah, things like that should be used as wherever possible. Then there's the old champions. And that's the nice thing about open source. There are new programs, but also very old software. For example, LaTeX as a layouting system or text setting system. And it's quite stable and available nearly everywhere. And that's where you can program your text. And basically, what's the right software? For me, selecting the correct software is basically dominated by the question of the function, since I know of open software. So the function is key, of course, but then there's the openness, because I think digital sovereignty is only maintainable using open source, and of course, protection of private data. And the question, does software protect my private data? Can that be evaluated independently? And that's a big question. Can I myself check that, or instruct someone else to check that? Or can I trust other people who I don't know personally maybe and trust what they are saying? And open source software lives from a lot, survives because of a lot of free developers, and also because a lot of people are using the software, and so it gets used and worked on a lot. And whenever you have an idea, you can include it. And whenever you have the choice between two softwares, one is open, one is not, then maybe you should prefer the open source product if it does the job. And most importantly, there's always a very strong and helpful community. Yeah. So I don't know how it is about time. Yeah, time is pretty much done. So I'll skip just these lists of different open source software. So important might be communication. And in open source, you have everything you can think of. There is social media, activity software, finance software. So you can find pretty much everything. Android, Lineage OS, F-Droid Shop might be something you want to look at. And with open source software, to get started, it's a very good start to just do one application at a time. And nowadays, even the operating system can be tested virtually before you actually change your production environment. So if you really want to take a look at this and think about even changing your working environment, I always recommend just using a virtual machine first, so you can see if it actually works, what you think of doing, and what you read about. And then at some point, when you are certain it works, then you can do the change in your working environment. The other way around, you can also put your closed source software in a virtual machine. And that way you can have a Windows within a Linux machine for that software that you cannot get any other way. And that's it, basically. Yeah, thank you very much, Sam. We have a few questions from the audience. Great talk. So the basic question now is, what do you think? How many people in the industry are using open source versus closed source? Can you give a guess? Well, on the desktop, most people agree that the normal setup is mostly Windows. So mostly Microsoft Office Teams. But as soon as you're coming to a server environment, it's a bit different. But I have to say I'm quite biased in this, because I primarily like open source solutions and use those in my own professional life. So I'm administrating mostly open source software. But as soon as it is an internet service, it's mostly a Linux and OpenBSD. AWS, GC2 we have, that's guaranteed. So I can guarantee you that's also a Linux version. So yeah, server side, it's definitely a Linux or another open source. And Synology and NAS solutions, they usually have open source softwares. Synology has a NAS RAID, and automatically you have a Linux. And since users should probably prefer open source software, are there maybe one or two huge arguments for open source software for you at your company? And maybe for changing away from Microsoft Office? And yeah, the main argument is digital sovereignty. That's the main reason. In that moment where you use Microsoft Office 365, you will never fulfill European data security requirements, because everything will be handled in the US, and that's just simply not allowed in the Europe. And that is a big chance that in a few years it still exists and can still be used. So yeah, there are good reasons, and at least one very good reason, to change to make the change to LibreOffice. I mean, there are good reasons against it as well. You always have to remember that it is a change. And in every company, there will be some Excel files with some macros that are still around, and that has to be adjusted as well. So depending on how well they are made, that can be easier or can be quite painful. But when doing something from the ground up in a new company, I would always use open software. Whenever I would build a new company, I would mostly use open source, as far as possible. Last question. Where can you get help? Are there user groups if I need help as a developer, or I want to help as a developer? Yeah, there are. There are a lot of user groups. So for developer topics, Python, there's a Python user group. For Linux and open source, I liked learning in the user group Kasse. And typically they were meeting up once a month. And they were just telling stories the evening, over the course of an evening. And I really learned a lot there and could just profit off of their know-how. Yeah, they exist. And for the most diverse software products, there are user groups that are specific. I just recommend using your search engine of choice and just look for a user group and just go there. And usually they are also online via a web page. In Vienna, there are a few groups as well. And offline meeting grounds where once the pandemic is over, groups will meet again.